In the dense fog-heavy forests surrounding Tapalpa, Sunday mornings usually belong to the silence of the highlands. But on this particular morning, the air didn't carry the scent of pine or damp earth. It carried the rhythmic, mechanical thump of Black Hawk helicopters, flying low enough to rattle the windows of the colonial villas dotting the Jalisco countryside. Below the canopy, elite units of the Mexican army, guided by coordinates whispered in secure rooms in Washington, D.C., moved with a predatory stillness toward a high-walled compound. They weren't looking for a foot soldier or a local lieutenant. They were looking for a ghost who had haunted the Americas for over a decade. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known to the world as El Mencho, had long been a phantom. While other capos flaunted their wealth on social media or granted interviews to foreign journalists, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG, stayed in the shadows of the mountains. He was a man of the old school, a former avocado farmer and one-time police officer who understood that in the drug trade, visibility is a death sentence. Yet his invisibility had bought him an empire that stretched from the precursor chemical labs of China to the fentanyl-ravaged streets of the American Midwest. As the first flash-bang grenades detonated within the compound, the myth of El Mencho's invulnerability shattered in a cloud of magnesium and cordite. The operation was surgical, a rare moment of seamless coordination between Mexican special forces and U.S. intelligence. There were no long drawn-out firefights, no cinematic last stands, just the heavy breathing of soldiers as they breached the final perimeter and the sight of a man whose face was recognizable only from grainy, years-old DEA posters. The official report would later state that El Mencho was injured during the raid. As he was being airlifted toward Mexico City, the man who held a $15 million bounty on his head, the man responsible for the industrialization of the Mexican drug trade, reportedly drew his last breath. He died not in a hail of bullets like Pablo Escobar, but in the sterile, vibrating cabin of a military transport, miles above the territory he had ruled through terror. But in Mexico, a king's death is never the end of the story. It is merely the opening of a vacuum. As the sun climbed higher over Jalisco, the news began to filter through the encrypted messaging apps used by the cartel's foot soldiers. The structure of the CJNG was unlike the monolithic cartels of the 1990s. It was a corporate military hybrid. It organized into semi-autonomous cells that functioned like franchises. And across the country, those cells were about to receive the same order. Code Red. The first signs of the reckoning appeared on the highways. In Guadalajara, a city that prides itself on its culture and colonial beauty, the afternoon traffic was suddenly halted by men in tactical gear and masks. They weren't soldiers. They moved with a jagged, frantic energy. At several major intersections, buses were emptied at gunpoint. Passengers, students, office workers, grandmothers were forced onto the hot asphalt, clutching their bags as they watched the men pour gasoline over the seats. The fires started almost simultaneously. Huge plumes of oily black smoke rose into the sky, visible from the luxury hotels of the Minerva district. It wasn't just arson, it was a performance. And by burning the city's arteries, the cartel was sending a message to the government. You may have taken the head, but the body still has teeth. At the Guadalajara International Airport, the atmosphere shifted from the mundane boredom of travel to visceral panic. Passengers waiting for flights to Los Angeles and Mexico City watched through the floor-to-ceiling glass as fires erupted on the perimeter. The smell of burning rubber began to seep through the air conditioning vents. People didn't wait for instructions. They scrambled toward the upper levels, dragging suitcases, their eyes fixed on the black horizon. There were no announcements, only the sound of shutters being slammed shut by shopkeepers who knew what was coming. The violence wasn't contained to Jalisco. Like an infection traveling through the bloodstream, it spread to Guanajuato, to the tourist beaches of Puerto Vallarta. and as far as the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. In Cancun, a place designed for the escapism of foreigners, the smoke from torched vehicles drifted over all-inclusive resorts. The message was clear. No corner of the Republic was safe from the CJNG's reach. Amidst the chaos, the human cost was tallied in small, quiet moments of terror. A shopkeeper in Leon watched from behind a half-closed metal gate as a group of young men, barely out of their teens, set fire to a local bank. These weren't the narcos of television. They were the disposable youth of the slums, energized by a sense of power that only a gallon of gasoline and an AK-47 can provide. They didn't seem to have a plan beyond destruction, and in that lack of a plan lay the greatest danger. In the National Palace, President Claudia Sheinbaum faced the press. Her tone was measured, her face a mask of state-enforced calm. She spoke of normality and coordination, trying to project a sense of control over a situation that was clearly spiraling. Behind the scenes, however, the government was scrambling. The death of El Mencho was a political victory, a gift to the looming Trump administration in the North that had been threatening to designate cartels as terrorist organizations and launch unilateral missile strikes. But for the people living in the epicenter, the victory felt like a disaster. One woman interviewed on the streets of Guadalajara spoke with a trembling voice that captured the collective psyche of the nation. "We only go out when it's necessary now," she said, on her eyes scanning the empty street behind the reporter. "It's good that they're finishing these organizations, but the fear, you don't know how to react. You don't know who is in charge anymore." That question, who is in charge, was the one that truly terrified the intelligence analysts. El Mencho had been a brutal dictator, but he was a stabilizing force within his own criminal ecosystem. He managed the precursor import channels from China through the port of Manzanillo. He negotiated the cocaine shipments from the jungles of Colombia. He maintained a hierarchy that, while violent, was predictable. With him gone, the CJNG was no longer a single entity. It was a collection of heavily armed, traumatized, and ambitious factions. The successors weren't just the lieutenants El Mencho had handpicked. They were regional bosses who had been waiting for a moment of weakness to stop sending their percentages to the center. As night fell on the first day of the post-Mencho era, the fires began to burn out, leaving charred skeletons of vehicles across the nation's highways. The code red had paralyzed the country for 12 hours, but the real violence was just beginning to ferment. In the safe houses and mountain hideouts, men were looking at their phones, checking to see who was still answering and who had suddenly gone silent. The killing of a drug lord is often compared to a decapitation strike. The logic is that by removing the head, the body dies. But in the world of modern organized crime, the body doesn't die. It fragments. Every severed limb becomes a new, smaller, hungrier predator. In the silence of the night in Tapalpa, where the operation had begun, the military presence remained heavy. But the soldiers knew that they hadn't ended the war. They had simply changed its shape. The man who had been the glue of the most powerful criminal organization on earth was gone. And as the first reports of internal purges began to surface from the border towns, it became clear that the show of force by the government had unlocked a door that no one knew how to close. The shadow of El Mencho still loomed over the landscape, but it was shifting, stretching out into 1,000 different directions, each one leading toward a new and unpredictable conflict. The question wasn't whether the cartel would survive, but what it would become in the absence of the man who had built it from the blood of his rivals. As the second day dawned, the smoke cleared to reveal a Mexico that looked the same, yet felt fundamentally different. The roads were open again, but the people driving on them kept their windows rolled up and their eyes on the rearview mirror. They were waiting for the next movement in the shadows, the next sign that the vacuum was being filled. And in a small, nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of Colima, a phone rang. The man who picked it up didn't use a name. He didn't need to. He simply listened to the report from the border, his eyes fixed on a map of the Pacific trade routes. The king was dead, but the crown was lying in the dust, and the first person to reach it would have to wade through a sea of blood to put it on. The transition from a centralized empire to a state of code red was not a spontaneous eruption. It was a pre-programmed reflex. For years, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel had functioned less like a traditional mafia and more like a paramilitary corporation with a sophisticated contingency plan. When the news of the Tapalpa raid hit the encrypted servers, the order didn't need to be debated. The coordination was chilling. In the state of Guanajuato, the response was immediate. At roughly 3:45 p.m., a dozen men in tactical vests blocked the main artery connecting the industrial hub of Leon to the rest of the country. They didn't just stop traffic. They curated a scene of terror. Drivers were pulled from their cars with a practiced efficiency. There was no shouting, no negotiation, just the shatter of glass and the smell of accelerant. Within minutes, the horizon was punctuated by the skeletal frames of burning SUVs, with their tires popping like small explosions in the heat. For the ordinary Mexican citizen, this was the Red Code Symphony. It is a tactic designed to paralyze the state's ability to move reinforcements, but its primary target is the civilian psyche. In the city of Guadalajara, the silence was perhaps more frightening than the noise. The streets, usually teeming with vendors and the chaotic hum of urban life, emptied in an instant. It was a ghost city by dusk. The only movement came from the flickering lights of convenience stores that had been looted and set ablaze, their neon signs buzzing fitfully through the thick, acrid smoke. Amidst this, the internal mechanics of the cartel began to grind. The CJNG was built on a foundation of franchises. El Mencho had allowed regional commanders a degree of autonomy in exchange for absolute loyalty and a cut of the precursor chemical trade. But loyalty is a fragile currency when the man who enforces it is no longer breathing. Consider the logistical nightmare now facing the lieutenants. The CJNG controls the port of Manzanillo, the primary gateway for chemical precursors arriving from China. These chemicals, the raw ingredients for fentanyl and methamphetamine, are the lifeblood of the organization. Without a central authority to arbitrate who gets which shipment and who controls which laboratory, the strategic border corridors into the United States became contested ground. The friction started in the shadows of the lower ranks. Every 600 yards of territory became a potential front line. In the neighborhoods of Zapopan, the lookouts, often boys no older than 15 equipped with high-end radios, began to receive conflicting orders. One commander wanted the roadblocks maintained. Another wanted the men to pull back and protect the private estates of the high-ranking jefes. This wasn't a strategic disagreement. It was the first tremor of a civil war. The human cost of this fragmentation is rarely found in the casualty counts of the soldiers or gangsters. It is found in the collateral moments. In a residential district of Tlaquepaque, a family sat in their living room, the lights turned off, listening to the sound of high-caliber gunfire 3 blocks away. They aren't part of the trade. They don't know the names of the successors, but they are the ones who will live with the code red for the rest of their lives. The psychological weight of knowing that your city can be shut down in 30 minutes by a ghost command is a burden that doesn't lift when the fires go out. While the world focused on the dramatic images of burning buses, a more subtle and dangerous shift was occurring within the global supply chain. The CJNG's reach isn't limited to the dusty roads of Jalisco. They have alliances with Ecuadorian gangs to secure cocaine transit routes and deep ties with Chinese brokers for synthetic production. With the king of the Pacific gone, the price of precursors began to fluctuate on the dark web. The stability of the world's most profitable illegal market was suddenly at risk. In the United States, the pressure was mounting. The death of El Mencho was a trophy for the intelligence community, but the fentanyl was still flowing. 96% of seizures happened at the border. a statistic that highlights the sheer volume of the trade. The industrialization that El Mencho pioneered had created a machine so efficient that it could seemingly run itself. But machines need operators. As night deepened, the reports from the state of Michoacan indicated that rival groups, most notably the weakened but opportunistic Sinaloa cartel, were testing the perimeters. They were moving into the patchwork of regional territories that the CJNG had claimed. It was an invitation for a massacre. Splinter groups, sensing the shift in gravity, began to flip their allegiances. In the world of the cartels, an opportunistic crime is not just a theft. It is an assassination of a former ally to prove your worth to a new master. The governor of Jalisco remained in permanent session. The Code Red still officially in effect. The military patrols were constant, their armored vehicles rumbling through empty plazas. But there is a limit to what an army can do against an enemy that is part of the architecture of the city itself. You cannot shoot a shadow and you cannot arrest a feeling of dread. By 2 a.m., the fires had largely been extinguished, leaving the smell of charred plastic and cold ash to hang over the Republic. The immediate shock was over, but the spiral of retaliation was just beginning to take its first turns. The question of who would control the revenue nodes, the ports, the routes, the labs, remained unanswered. In a secure facility in the capital, the body of the man who started it all lay under a white sheet. Outside, the country he had reshaped in his image was vibrating with a new chaotic energy. The successors weren't just fighting for money, they were fighting for survival. In this game, there is no silver medal. There is only the crown or a shallow grave. The vacuum was no longer empty. It was filling with the ambitions of a dozen smaller men, each one believing they could be the next ghost of the mountains. And as the first light of Monday morning touched the smoke-stained walls of Guadalajara, the people of Mexico began to realize that the end of El Mencho might not be the end of the nightmare, but rather the beginning of a much more fragmented and unpredictable horror. Somewhere in the northern state of Sonora, a convoy of darkened SUVs pulled off a dirt track and disappeared into a warehouse. No shots were fired. No buses were burned. But the men inside were looking at the same map El Mencho had once studied, and their silence was more ominous than any explosion. The transition was underway, and the next part of the reckoning was already being written in the blood of those who thought the war was over. The monolithic structure that El Mencho spent 3 decades building was designed to be a fortress. But the problem with fortresses is that they are built to keep enemies out, not to keep those inside from tearing each other apart. By the 3rd day following the Tapalpa raid, the Code Red violence had transitioned from an outward display of cartel strength to an inward purge. The grand architecture of the CJNG began to fracture into what intelligence analysts call splinter groups, smaller, leaner, and infinitely more volatile. In the high-stakes geography of the Mexican drug trade, there is no such thing as empty space. Every kilometer of highway, every shipping container in the port of Manzanillo, and every local police commander on the payroll is a revenue node. When the central authority vanishes, these nodes become prizes. The vacuum left by El Mencho didn't just invite ambition. It invited a Darwinian struggle where the only rule was speed. If you didn't claim the local plaza by noon, your rival would claim it by sunset, and they would likely start by executing your family. The first major fracture appeared in the state of Michoacan. For years, the CJNG had maintained a tentative, its blood-soaked border with the remnants of the Knights Templar and various self-defense groups. Within 48 hours of the king's death, these local factions, the patchwork groups, sensed a shift in the gravity of power. They stopped paying the piso, the extortion tax demanded by Jalisco. In response, a CJNG lieutenant, known only by his alias El Jardinero, reportedly dispatched a convoy of 50 armored trucks to reestablish order. But the men in those trucks weren't fighting for the CJNG anymore. They were fighting for El Jardinero. This is the hidden mechanics of a fragmented empire. The ideology of the cartel, the new generation mythos, evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw, individual survival. In the midst of this chaos, the political pressure from the North acted like a catalyst. In Washington, the narrative was one of triumph. But at the border, the reality was a spike in opportunistic violence. U.S. agencies observed a strange phenomenon, a sudden surge in the purity of fentanyl crossing the San Isidro port of entry. It wasn't a sign of better production. It was a sign of desperation. Regional bosses were dumping their stockpiles, turning product into cash as quickly as possible to fund the private armies they would need for the coming Civil War. The human cost of this high-level power struggle trickled down to the most mundane levels of Mexican life. In a small town on the border of Jalisco and Guanajuato, a local mechanic was approached by two different groups of armed men in the same afternoon. Both demanded he repair their vehicles for free. Both claimed to represent the true Jalisco New Generation. The mechanic, a man who had spent 30 years fixing engines and staying out of trouble, was faced with a choice that had no right answer. To say yes to one was to sign a death warrant with the other. He didn't choose. He locked his shop, took his wife and 3 children, and began the long, uncertain drive toward the northern border. He is not a narco, but he is a casualty of the vacuum. Inside the Scheinbaum administration, the mood was one of juggling. The death of El Mencho was a necessary sacrifice to keep the Trump administration from following through on threats of direct military action on Mexican soil. It was a pragmatic departure point in the relationship between the state and the cartels. By giving up the big fish, the Mexican state bought itself a temporary reprieve from American intervention. But the cost was a localized, fragmented war that the federal government was ill-equipped to fight. You can negotiate with a single leader. You cannot negotiate with 1,000 angry shards. The decapitation strategy has a long history of failure in Mexico. When the Beltran Leyva organization was decapitated, it birthed a dozen hyper-violent gangs like the Guerreros Unidos. When the Zetas were fractured, and the result was a decade of indiscriminate kidnapping and extortion. Now the CJNG was following the same trajectory. The sophisticated supply chain that El Mencho had perfected, the China to Ohio pipeline, was being disrupted not by police, but by the very men who ran the warehouses. A key point often overlooked is the role of the precursor import channels. These are not just business deals. They are personal relationships built on years of trust and billions of dollars in laundered money. Chinese brokers don't deal with the cartel. They deal with individuals. With El Mencho gone, those individuals were now free agents. By Tuesday night, reports began to surface of encrypted communications between CJNG splinter cells and the Sinaloa cartel. The old rivalries were being set aside in favor of new, pragmatic alliances. None of the Sinaloa-Jalisco merger, once thought impossible, was suddenly a terrifying possibility. As the third part of this reckoning unfolded, the violence became less about burning buses and more about surgical disappearances. In the suburbs of Guadalajara, high-ranking accountants and money movers began to vanish. They were the ones who knew where the liquid assets were held, where the real estate was registered, and which foreign bank accounts held the billions in digital currency. The war wasn't just being fought with rifles. It was being fought with spreadsheets and passwords. In the morgues of the central states, the bodies were piling up, many of them bearing the hallmarks of internal purges. Men found with their own phones stuffed in their mouths, a grim message about leaks and rats. The air of complete normality that the government tried to project was a thin veil over a society that was holding its breath. The most dangerous man in Mexico was no longer a ghost in the mountains of Tapalpa. The most dangerous man was the lieutenant who had just realized that the only thing standing between him and a billion-dollar empire was the life of the man sitting next to him in the armored SUV. The structure was still intact, as the Oxford analyst noted, but the soul of the organization had been replaced by a frantic, jagged greed. The sun set on the third day with a peculiar stillness. The roadblocks had been cleared, the fires were out, and the code red had been officially lifted. But in the darkened offices of the National Intelligence Code, the monitors showed a different story. The pings of activity were moving away from the centers of power and toward the ports and the border. The fragmentation was complete. The pieces were moving. And as the night deepened, a single, unarmored sedan pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of Tijuana. The driver didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a tired businessman. He made one call, a 30-second conversation in Mandarin, and then crushed the phone under his heel. The king was dead, and the world he built was being sold off, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. The only thing left to see was who would survive the sale. By the fourth day, the smoke over Guadalajara had long since dissipated, replaced by the heavy, humid stillness of a Mexican summer. On the surface, the government's narrative of complete normality seemed to have taken hold. The airports were functioning, the roadblocks were gone, and the burned-out husks of buses had been hauled away to scrapyards. But normality in Mexico is a fragile lacquer, and beneath it, the geography of the drug trade was being rewritten in silence. The death of El Mencho was not the end of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. It was the beginning of its industrial evolution. Without a single charismatic patriarch to hold the center, whom the organization transitioned into a series of highly efficient, disconnected cells, it became a hydra. In the world of synthetic drugs, this fragmentation is not a weakness. It is a survival mechanism. A centralized cartel has a head that can be cut off. A fragmented network of laboratories, brokers, and logistics experts is nearly impossible to decapitate. The most haunting aspect of the post-Mencho era is the realization that the machine he built is now autonomous. The flow of fentanyl into the United States did not stutter. In 2024 alone, over 48,000 Americans died from overdoses, and the chemical precursors continue to arrive at the Pacific ports with the regularity of a heartbeat. The individuals moving these chemicals, the invisible brokers, don't care whose face is on the $15 million reward poster. They care about the purity of the meth, the stability of the supply chain, and the bottom line. For the ordinary people of Jalisco, the legacy of the Code Red is a permanent state of hypervigilance. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a neighborhood when a tinted SUV with no license plates rolls slowly down the street. It is a silence born of the knowledge that the human element, the unpredictable whims of a nervous young gunman, is now the primary law of the land. The industrialization of the trade has left behind a surplus of weapons and a generation of young men who have been trained for a war that no longer has a clear objective. In the hallways of power in Mexico City and Washington, the raid at Tapalpa is recorded as a milestone of cooperation. It relieved the immediate pressure of the Trump administration's threats and allowed President Sheinbaum to project a hardline image. But in the mountain villages where the ghost once hid, the villagers don't talk about milestones. They talk about the afterward. They talk about the way the local police now look the other way, even more than before, not out of corruption, but out of a paralyzing fear of picking the wrong side in a civil war with no clear front lines. The true cost of the drug war is not found in the dramatic arrest of a kingpin, but in the uncontrolled consequences that follow. It is found in the displacement of families like the mechanic from Guanajuato, in the normalization of code red drills in primary schools, and in the quiet resignation of a society that has seen too many kings fall to believe that the throne will ever stay empty. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting long, golden shadows across the port of Manzanillo, the cranes continue to move. Containers from across the ocean are lowered onto trucks that will vanish into the vast network of Mexican highways. Somewhere in a darkened room, a new commander is looking at a screen, watching the pings of a GPS tracker moving north. He doesn't have El Mencho's name, and he doesn't want his fame. He only wants the silence to continue. The law enforcement operations like the one in Tapalpa show a determination to reclaim the state, but the collapse of a criminal hierarchy often brings a peace that is as cold and brittle as ice. The reach of past deeds, the lingering loyalties, and the sheer momentum of a billion-dollar industry mean that the shadows will always find a way to stretch out again. In the story of the Jalisco New Generation is a reminder that in the underworld, power is never destroyed. It is only redistributed. As the lights of Guadalajara flicker on, one by one, the city looks like any other metropolis. But if you listen closely, past the hum of the traffic and the noise of the bars, there is a pulse. It is the sound of a machine that hasn't missed a beat. In the end, one has to wonder, if the removal of the most powerful drug lord in the world doesn't change the price of a pill on a street corner 4,000 miles away, who is truly in control? Is it the men with the guns, the governments with the helicopters, or is it the machine itself, an entity that has outgrown its creators and now demands a blood sacrifice just to keep the gears turning? The king is dead. The code red has faded to a dull, permanent amber. And as the night takes hold, the only certainty is that somewhere in the darkness, the next ghost is already being born.